Hello, friends. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and today I wanted to share with you a conversation that I have pretty regularly. And since I had it a couple times this past week, it seemed like it was good to put something out on it. Being a trauma therapist, one of the things that I end up talking to people a lot about is what has happened to them in the past, and especially hearing people negatively judge themselves because an event was traumatizing. A lot of times people come up with the idea that this event was not bad enough. I should not have been traumatized by this. The fact that it's still with me means something about me. And so I wanted to share some thoughts about that because I think it's a misconception about how trauma works and what we're, I don't know, allowed to be traumatized by. So let's start off with the end. Once trauma has occurred, if we were to ask a bunch of people, like I feel like we could come up with a hierarchy of like, yes, war trauma is worse than childhood abuse. Childhood abuse is worse than violent crime. You ask 100 people, they'll come up with like some sort of hierarchy of like, here, these events should be worse. What actually happens in the brain at the end when trauma has occurred? The brain doesn't give a damn about whether an event should have been traumatizing. Basically, there's a few things that can open the door for a negative event to be traumatizing. If that door swings open and trauma occurs, it literally doesn't matter whether we think it should be trauma or not. It will feel horrifying inside the brain. And so we have to treat it like trauma. And sadly, there's a lot of people who neglect getting treatment for a long time because it's like they haven't given themselves permission to be traumatized by the thing because they feel like they shouldn't have been. So I wanted to share with you today basically the ways that the door swings open for trauma and, kind of open it up because I would love to see a lot more people get trauma treatment way earlier instead of waiting 10, 15, 20 years to get treated. So here's how this works. Whenever there's a negative event, there's a few things that happen that open up the opportunity for it to be traumatizing. Basically, all that has to happen is the fight or flight response has to go off and then a couple of other things. So as soon as the adrenaline response, fight or flight, happens, the door is now opening for trauma. So hopefully, most of the time, our fight or flight response lets us deal with the problem. We run away from the threat. We fight our way free of the threat. If fight or flight goes off and the threat ends, trauma is less likely. It can still happen, but it's much less likely. If fight or flight fails to resolve the situation, the door opens further because then when it fails, the most likely scenario is we enter some type of freeze response. That can look a lot of different ways. It can be partial or full. It can be like your mind freezes, but your body keeps moving. The freeze can be a lot of things. But if the freeze response occurs, the door's wide open, and now trauma is becoming very, very likely. And then if you enter an altered state along with your freeze, usually there's time distortion or object fixation. People who describe violent crimes with a gun get often object fixation. All they can see is the barrel. But if an altered state occurs, trauma is practically guaranteed at this point. So that's only three things. Three things have to happen. Adrenaline response goes off and the door is open. The freeze response occurs in some form or fashion, and now trauma is becoming very likely. The altered state occurs and trauma becomes guaranteed. That's it. That's all that has to happen. And because our brains are complex and because they make connections in complex ways, our fight or flight response can go off due to an awful lot of things. There are certain things that's going to set it off more regularly and more likely. So war trauma, violent crime, those kind of things are more likely to set it off. But if we, get to the unlikely stuff, a loud noise can set off your fight or flight response. Now, is that too likely to turn into trauma? No, not necessarily, but it opens the door. If somebody walked in and had trauma from fireworks going off at the wrong time, I wouldn't be shocked. It would be unusual, but that would fit in with how trauma works. So it would be in no way shocking. If a pet dies, I've treated that trauma before. Fight or flight response goes off because of, oh my God, this terrible thing's happening. Freeze response occurs, altered state occurs, trauma. Trauma walks right in the door because it's wide open. This occurs even whenever the fight or flight response is small. This occurs a lot in negative job situations where people have stayed in that job too long. They start getting ready to walk into their workplace and they get that little trickle of adrenaline, like, because they don't want to be there. So the fight or flight response is starting to occur in a little way. And what happens, of course, the door's not wide open, but the door's cracked and it's a little open for trauma. Sometimes, and that's how wear and tear trauma occurs. Sometimes we get trauma responses over time, but because that adrenaline response is occurring, the door's cracked. Trauma can get in. So I put this out for people so that you don't end up in a scenario where you're deciding that other people's trauma should be able to beat up your trauma. Like, oh, I'm not going to go get treatment. There's so many people who have it so much worse. If you forget everything I say, remember this part. Inside your brain, there is nothing worse than your trauma. There is no objective measure by which we rank traumas insofar as like what it feels like. Your trauma feels worse than anything else, and there's no objective measure. So, for heaven's sake, if this is occurring to you, get treatment. Any skilled trauma therapist will absolutely know this information and will not be judging you because like you got traumatized by something that is more unusual. So hopefully this information is helpful to people. TLDR, if you have trauma, get treated for trauma. Don't wait because you think somebody else's is so much worse. Thank you for hanging out with me today for a little bit. I'm Jonathan Pishner with Apex Counseling, and I will see you guys next time.